Two journeys in one. The journal got more interesting and smoothly written and more introspective. Instead of just writing about the day's events, it went back to previous times in my life. It spoke about graduating from college in economics without a very distinguished record, and then getting my first job at a car rental center. Not great work, but it was a job, and it meant I wasn't living at home like some of my friends. There was a friend Jimmy who dropped out of college and was still at home. That hit me like a bombshell because that was the guy who had sent the letter. Jimmy had always been a friend, apparently, and I kept up contact with him for a while, but it was hard to be friends with someone who just sat in his basement playing video games and working at 7-Eleven. That's right, he was that much of a cliché. He stopped wanting to see me too, as I got more successful, but I wasn't the only one he closed himself off to. He had a dog who eventually constituted his full circle of friends, and his mother stopped even trying to dislodge him from the basement. My second job was as a car salesman. I slowly worked my way up and started getting the better leads. It's amazing the politics that go on in a car dealership. And I was doing okay. I met Stacy at a bar in Providence. Her long brown hair and green eyes drew me to her, and her down-to-earth way of talking, even with her accent, was like a melody. She was exciting to me. I didn't have a good attitude toward Warwick or the people there then either, but with her, an offensive white trash charm was part of the attraction. She unironically said wicked. The reason I moved to Warwick and not the other way around was only that my apartment was smaller and occupied a very bleak stretch of Route 1. But there I was, in the pits, but also in heaven. I was thinking about marrying her. I wrote about how my life was getting better with every year, and I talked about thanks to someone, not really God, just some kind of power in the heavens. I couldn't tell if I'd had a religious childhood and rejected God, or if I was coming to God. All I could tell was that I had some vague idea of purpose, or a reason for being. I didn't write about my parents much. They were mentioned in passing, but they weren't a presence. The way I talked about them, always saying they or my parents instead of mom and dad, made it sound like they had disappeared or died. Or maybe I didn't talk to them. Maybe they were the source of that trauma Dr. Forrester had talked about. A few times I hit myself in the head trying to jolt myself back to them, but nothing came. The journal kept going like that, but finally some cracks in my perfect life appeared. Stacy could get a little moody. Not a big deal, but it got worse. I talked about how she loved pot a little too much. I guess I smoked with her, but she was high all the time, to the point that it was getting expensive. We did get married, and here I mentioned my parents. I said they were at the reception and wished us well. Well, that's all. No funny stories, no touching statements, and no fights or incidents. Not long after, as in less than 9 months, we had Jamie, and I got my job at the insurance company. I thought everything really was falling into place. I could sense that pride you have when you were a real, upstanding part of the community. A real man with a real family. How the cookie crumbles. But all kinds of little problems started getting amplified. Stacy got moodier, and I couldn't understand why. Pot doesn't change your personality too much, and it doesn't make people irritable or angry. But then I found out she was taking pills. Percocet. When I asked her, she said she had gotten them from her friend after the baby was born because it helped her sleep, and it got her through those long days home alone. Jamie wasn't colicky, but I got it. It can be a real long day when you are all alone and the baby just won't stop crying. But she also just plain loved Percocet. She had some friend who took it too, and apparently they talked about it like their best friend. And for the most part, when she took it, she was cool, fun-loving, energetic, and everything else I loved about her. It was when she ran out that she would get down. So I'd help her stay stocked up and said she could stop when the baby got older, maybe in a couple more months. But that always turned into a couple more months after that, and so forth and so on. I don't know why I didn't start. I guess I was worried about the money. The absolute rock bottom we could get for them was $10 each if we couldn't get a prescription, which was always a big runaround. I also started losing friends, not for anything she or I did, but because other friends started getting jealous, just like Jimmy. Most of my other friends, who were only ever mentioned by first name, weren't progressing in life. Or let's just say it was more like they still had different lifestyles and schedules and lived pretty far away after I moved. And I could never hang out with them. And then I started to turn on Warwick in general. I've already said my first impression post-Fugue was that it looked like a shithole. And I was of a like mind in the journal. I mean, I could tell there were some nice people in the background, but for me, it wasn't a friendly place. And I stopped being friendly back. There were also a few people I knew or knew slightly that I had to deny claims for, and that took down the last of my friendships and acquaintances. People only acted nice when I was paying them for something. Stacy felt it too, because her friends started backing off. The thing was, she clung to them pretty hard, and to keep them, she had to go against me. After Jamie got to be a toddler, she'd leave me with him after a long day of work. The second I got home, she'd just shoot out the door like an anxious cat, and I wouldn't see her all night. And since she slept all day, the house would be a mess. No clean clothes, no food, not even sheets on the bed for Jamie sometimes. And then that went on for a couple of years. I wasn't good about keeping the journal for a while, but the trajectory downward was clear. I sounded like I was just trying to get through one day, 1 week, 1 month, and trying to fast forward as much as I could. And then when school started for Jamie, we found out he probably had a learning disability, and it was pretty impossible to give him enough extra time with things like counting and all the stuff he had to do that was so hard. I thought they were pushing him too much, and I didn't see why he should have to know all his letters in kindergarten. So he started getting miserable, and when I said something to the teachers, that just made me unpopular with them too. And so I had to put my foot down with Stacy and tell her that I would have to work longer hours so he could have some special tutoring, and she was just going to have to spend her evenings at home with Jamie and do things like count with him. So then that didn't go great because she didn't practice with him after school. She would say she did, but in reality, she was taking him with her to her friends and didn't change the way she lived at all. I'd come home to the house empty, and they'd come back at 2 or 3 a.m., and when I said something, she'd say, "He was fine, he slept in the guest room," all this. But then he'd go to school the next day in the same clothes and no bath, tired as hell, and they'd call me. And to tell the truth, at that point in reading the journal, it got really hard to tell what was going on. After that, I started really pouring emotions out to the point where I would have called myself a milksop if I didn't know who I was. But at least in all that whining, I found out about my parents. When I was a kid, they weren't mean or abusers or anything, but they were pretty damn neglectful. They just didn't really take care of me or make me feel loved. At least that's what I said in the journal. They also always compared me to relatives or other kids they knew. And at certain times, they would sit slouched on the sofa saying I was a worthless loser. No kidding. They would tell me that once in a while. Worse was this look of disappointment. The squint is what I called it in the journal, where they would just shake their heads at me like I disgusted them. I compared myself to a defective item they forgot to send back before the return date. So the journal ended in a confused mess. I wasn't putting down dates anymore, and what I said was all mixed up between the day's events, my past, and whatever else came to mind. In the last few pages, there was a paragraph that said I was going to put it in a safe deposit box in case anything happened, and that I would continue it in another book. It said I wanted people to know my side of the story. That wasn't the very end, though. The last thing in there was about how Jamie and I had sat down to eat a couple Suzy Q's, and they made a big mess on our fingers and faces. I have no idea what significance that had. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just where the story stopped. Back in Cali again. By the time I got home, I was pretty grumpy. Getting back to the simplicity of my life in California highlighted what kind of storm I had escaped. Aubrey could see that right away, and she said I should take a couple days in the shed and rest up. Turns out I needed it. Without it, I probably would have said something to a client or socked someone in the nose. She spent a lot of time asking me about the trip. Really open-ended questions, no point to them. That was nice. Much better than what the psychologists, who always had some kind of agenda, had done. I didn't want to dirty things up with bad news, so I didn't tell her much about the journal, but talking about the good parts made me realize there were still some decent people like Todd, and that in spite of how I wished I had never learned any of this, I still wanted to be a father to Jamie. Talking to her in a chilly shed with a propane lantern felt like home, a real home, the safe place I had never known as a child, and that I could provide for Stacy, but not enjoy. I started to fall in love with Aubrey around then. I decided that whether or not Aubrey and I turned into anything more than whatever we were, I would stay in California, at least for now. Talking to Scott, I found that fighting Stacy would be tough. First of all, we weren't married. I have no idea how that happened exactly. I guess we just said we were married and never went through the legality of it. Stacy has never given me an explanation. What it meant was that she had no rights to my vast wealth, but every right to dictate visitation. And if she wanted none, the reality was she'd get it. My fault or not, I'd been gone for a long time, and there was no guarantee I wouldn't disappear again. In the meantime, I used my newfound job experience to get work doing accounts payable at Home Depot, and I went to an accounting course. As much as could be arranged, my next job was going to be behind the scenes and boring. No people, just numbers. I dragged my feet about moving out of the shed, saying I'd do that after the court case was over, because who knows, I might get some visitation, and then I'd want to move. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. In reality, I didn't want to detach from Aubrey. That would leave me all alone out there. I was afraid of what my own apartment would look like. My vision of it was an all-white place with bulbs hanging from the ceiling and black windows. A kitchen with a folding table with a half-eaten bowl of mac and cheese on it and a newspaper. I flew out for the court case, and let's just say they made quick work of me. Scott prepared me as well as he could, but I went in alone, and it was her game to lose. She looked pretty well put together and had a neighbor and her mother there to vouch for her. I had no one, not even Aubrey. That wouldn't have done much except bring doubt on whether I would really want to stay in Rhode Island. Stacy painted me as a bad guy, and with no memory, I didn't have a rebuttal and not much to go on as far as being a dependable citizen. Her lawyer made the Fugue look like an excuse to bug out. The judge awarded me no visitation and hit me with support payments. For some reason, he actually looked at what I earned and based it off that, which wasn't too bad because I've heard a lot worse being done. Still, I would be on the edge of poverty as far as the eye could see. As all that happened, I studied the tiny courtroom. It was no big wood-paneled hall. It was kind of junky, with boxes stacked up against the wall, just like any office. I remember the smell of the wood and the exact grain lines on the table where I sat. The parents. After it was done, I had one of the second category of memories I ever got from my previous life. It was a feeling. The feeling of being a loser. And I know it was the same one that came from my parents. That's how I felt as they sat there on the couch telling me I was worthless. Before I went home, I tracked down what happened to them. I had to go to New Hampshire for that, where they had moved back after they retired. It took an extra 3 days altogether. As I worked with the police there, I found out that, as usual, Detective Brown had already talked to them and had never said anything to me. I swear by that point he was out to torture me. My dad was an HVAC repairman, which means we weren't poor. He did pretty well, actually. One day, a few months before I went missing, they were found dead in their house from carbon monoxide poisoning. How did an HVAC repairman fall into something that simple? Because it was on purpose. They were found after the mailman had gotten suspicious. The mailbox was not getting cleared out, and then he noticed a letter from my dad to himself amongst the mail. It was his suicide note. He thought it could get lost if he left it out on the coffee table. In fact, he sent 2 notes, the other to his place of employment. If there was a note to me, I have no way of knowing it. What he said was that he'd always been depressed and just couldn't stand it anymore. He made his wife depressed too, and he knew he had affected me as well. It contained an apology for that. Sure, there was more, but it was self-pity and psychobabble. Since it was part of the evidence or something, the police had given me a copy, but I didn't keep it. Jimmy. I was about to go home once and for all when I decided I better go see Jimmy. He was on the way home, sort of, and he had written a letter after all. I'd blown him off the last time, no reason to be a jerk again. His mother met me at the door, and then he came up with his dog, a pit. He didn't look all that bad. I expected a fat guy with long, stringy hair. But except for being a little overweight, he looked fairly clean-cut with a goatee. We went down to his basement lair. He seemed like an okay guy. I think he felt better about himself after he heard that I had kind of crashed and burned. He wanted me to see this movie that we had watched as teenagers a lot. He still had it on a copied VHS tape, Return of the Living Dead. He thought it might bring back some memories. It didn't, other than a feeling, a sense of being carefree. We used to drink whiskey and watch movies. I didn't want any whiskey, and neither did he, but it was a good movie. I could see why I liked it. It was hilarious, in fact. So I went home having met a boss who wasn't a bad guy and an old friend who was better off than I thought. I tried not to let the rest bother me. I figured I would treat the payments like taxes and live on whatever was left over. As for Jamie, I was just going to have to accept my fate. Aubrey's oldest went to college the next year, a real residential college, and she let me have her room. Things were pretty smooth at that point, but I must say, I often thought about how my time in that park with the tent was really the best part of my life. I had had the same carefree feeling I sensed at Jimmy's. Now, since I couldn't actually remember anything, just hear about it, I could still be carefree, even knowing about the baggage. I had hopes for Aubrey, but for the time being, we were platonic. I was a house guest, a close house guest, but a house guest nonetheless. The miracle. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that your story never ends, much like it never begins. Rather, you fade into your life with no clear sense of a starting line. I've had that twice, when I was born and when they found me on morning drive. But it really happens every day. We fade into consciousness every time we wake up, don't we? And when you think about it, dying is just fading away. You can go one of two general ways, and they both come out the same. Way number one, you die in your sleep. That's fading out. Also, way number 1, you die of something like carbon monoxide poisoning, like my parents. Or you die of some disease. Still fading out. Way number 2, you die in an accident or by violence. That's a definite the end to everyone else. But for you, you'll never be able to contemplate it. So you're not aware of any end. It just stops without your knowledge. And that's fading out. So, your life story only has a beginning, middle, and end from the outside, after you're dead. And if you choose to pretend it does for yourself while you're still alive, you'll have to keep modifying it all along. That's pretty much what happened next. It looked to me like my life's main events were over, and after this, the rest would just be, and eventually he died. But no, the story kept going. Stacy finally took things too far and OD'd, just like that. Her mother wanted nothing to do with Jamie, even if it meant the child support, and that left me as sole guardian. I was out there the next day, went with Jamie to the funeral, and took him home with me. Boom. Those were some hard weeks for Jamie. He slept on a cot in my room. Being alone wasn't working for him, and he was up a lot wondering where he was. We had to figure out school and a whole bunch of other stuff, and he cried all the time about his mother. I learned bits and pieces about how things were in Warwick. As I see it, he had turned into a cash cow in the form of my child support payments, along with frequent extra payments on request for things like school supplies or clothes. It was all lies. She had been on meth, as I suspected, and it got worse and worse, as usual. No one from CPS was there to notice or do anything about it, and she finally kicked it right there in that crap apartment of hers. It turns out a boyfriend had been there who vanished when he saw she was dying. Jamie had to figure out what to do on his own and ended up appearing on the neighbor's side door in just his underwear at 3 a.m. So I finally got an apartment, and Jamie and I set up shop there. I think I'm pretty much doing things right, but it'll be a long time before things are straightened out, if ever. He tells me more things about life with Stacy, sometimes completely out of the blue, and we have a counselor who keeps telling us it will take a lot of time to process everything. At his age, she says, it probably feels like getting put into a teleporter and being beamed to a different world. I know what she's talking about. Anyway, I've got real purpose now. That fear of going back into a fugue is gone. I don't try to remember anything from before, and I hope I never do. And that's where it stops for now. There are more pages in this journal, but it seems like a pretty good place to break. I scribbled on the last page, as you can see, and I'll keep going on after that until it runs out of space. Then I'll put this in the safe deposit box with the other journal and start another. Sometimes someone will read it. Hopefully you, Jamie, when you're old enough. I hope I'm not dead for some bizarre reason. I hope you like that I made it into kind of a story instead of a journal with dates and everything like the last one. I didn't have time for the day-to-day anyway. I don't care if you want to read the first one, but like I said, it's a little hinky. I don't have a moral for you, not yet. Maybe after the next one. But you should know you may have felt like a rag doll back then, after I left and after I came back. But I cared about you and loved you, and I'm proud I could finally be there for you. I hope the book means something to you. This will all be a distant memory for you sometime, but you'll know what was going on through my mind, and when it stops for me, at least it won't blow away in the wind. At least you'll remember. You'll know what happened before.